The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, David Daley on how independent redistricting commissions are being undermined by partisan pressures. Peter Fenn on why Democratic campaigning needs to move out of the past. Plus, Bill Press with former New Jersey Governor Christine Todd Whitman on when it makes sense for Republican voters to back Democrats. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Discussions on gerrymandering often call for the creation of independent redistricting commissions to draw electoral maps and keep partisan politics out of the process. But as national gerrymandering expert David Daley explains, true independence is proving harder to achieve than expected. And we say hello to David Daley, author of Rat Effed, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count, and Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. He's also a senior fellow at Fair Vote. David Daley, welcome back. Always good to talk to you.
Thanks for having me back on, Jim.
Absolutely. In a recent op-ed in the New York Times, you drew our attention to a strategy voters have endorsed to limit the partisan impact of redistricting, and it's called independent commissions. Let's start off with what they are and what problems are they designed to overcome.
Absolutely. Voters hate partisan gerrymandering. It doesn't matter what state you're in, doesn't matter if it's red, blue, or purple. It's one thing everybody agrees on is that politicians should not be able to draw their own districts, choose their own voters. It's like giving the bank robber the ability to design the security system of the safe and all the codes. So what voters have tried to do in places like Michigan and Virginia and Ohio, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, is to try various forms of either independent commissions in which citizens or groups of citizens and lawmakers get together and work on these lines. It's an attempt to limit the amount of pure partisanship in the room, and it's an attempt to kind of put some guardrails on a process that really creates the building blocks of our democracy, these district lines.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as you explained in the New York Times, the independence of the independent commissions is being undermined. How is that happening?
That's the problem, right? It is hard to take the politics out of something as important as redistricting, because the backdrop for all of this at the U.S. House level, right, is that there's only 5 seats that separate Democrats and Republicans in the House in the 2022 midterms. So it is really hard to find swing districts that you can actually flip. It's a lot easier to use your power in states that Republicans control, like Texas, North Carolina, Florida, and Georgia. And instead of trying to win districts over, you simply draw them in such a way that you can lock them in for the next decade. So most of these commissions, they've got loopholes, right? And partisans are always the ones who are most determined to try to find them, especially Republican partisans who have embarked on a strategy of trying to rule from the minority rather than crafting positions that actually appeal to a changing American electorate.
Mm-hmm. To the extent that partisan interests are able to influence these independent commissions, what are your biggest concerns about what that could mean?
Well, I think that there are a lot of concerns, one of them being that citizens lose faith in the ability of democracy reforms to fix what it's been promised that they will cure. And I think that's a really serious problem here. But voters in all of these states wanted partisans out of the room when these maps were drawn. And when partisans sneak back in the room, it's like they're Stranger Things Halloween zombies or something, trying to find their way in through the windows when the doors are locked, that they still, find a way. It could undermine the integrity of these maps, and it could bake in a larger Republican advantage in some states than they would have had these maps been drawn in a fair way. If you take a state like Arizona right now, for example, where the Independent Commission has really been hijacked by Republicans as part of a 6 or 7 year strategy to stack the commission, its executive director, and then its map maker. Right now, that's a 5-4 Democratic delegation from Arizona. This commission could draw a map that is a 7-2 Republican commission. The other problem, I think, is that everybody knew that states like Texas and North Carolina and Florida and Georgia would be problems this year, that Republicans were likely to really go all out and have a bacchanalia of partisan gerrymandering in those states. But we had hoped, at least had our fingers crossed, that states like Michigan and Ohio and Colorado and Arizona might have a modicum of fairness to them. And if the process gets undermined in those states as well, we're really in for a brutal decade.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking to David Daley, author of Rat Effed, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count, and also Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. David's a senior fellow at Fair Vote. In the state of Virginia, when it came up to decide whether they wanted an independent commission, they put it to vote. People wanted it overwhelmingly, but they ended up with an independent commission that's part citizen, part politician. To me, that's one step forward, 2 steps back. I mean, are you more open to being steered a certain way, in a partisan way, with a setup like that?
Yeah, I think you are. I think, at least you've got some citizens on that commission. So that's certainly the one step forward there. And Virginia is the first time that any state legislature has ever willingly given up any control over this process without having it ripped away from them by voters via initiative or constitutional amendment. So there's some positives there. But when you've still got 8 partisans on the commission who are acting in very partisan ways, they are drawing their own maps still. It's not independent. And you end up with oftentimes those politicians looking out for themselves and their friends and their party, which again is not what people voted for.
Mm-hmm. Now, you cite several examples, of course, to make your case that this is something we need to be seriously concerned about. Talk about Michigan.
Boy, Michigan's an amazing example, right? Because 61% of voters in this state went to the polls in 2018 and they said, we want a new process. Our current maps are just gerrymandered beyond belief. I mean, Democrats have won more votes for the state house in Michigan every single year for the last decade, but under these maps, they've never been able to win more seats. Republicans have held control. Voters wanted something else. And one of the more mystifying things that this commission did is they hired a litigation counsel, one of the most partisan Republican law firms in Washington, a firm called Baker Hostetler, run by a principal named Mark Braden. Mark Braden was involved in the gerrymander of Ohio. He was involved in defending the Republican gerrymanders in Pennsylvania and North Carolina that courts overturned back in 2018 and 2019. When, so voters said they wanted a different process, but they end up, and guys like Mark Braden out of the room, but they find a way to worm their way in anyway. And it was really amazing to me when the initial draft maps just came out of Michigan's congressional districts, the Republican operative who drew the previous decade's maps back in 2011, and who has since apologized for them and become an anti-Trump Republican, and has made it clear that he understands how his maps help contribute to extremism and insanity in the state of Michigan. He took one look at these new congressional maps and he said that it was such a bad gerrymander, and he knew it because he had drawn maps that were exactly that, gerrymandered, and he was too embarrassed to actually submit them. And those were the maps that he kind of stuffed in his drawer and didn't show anybody. So if the voters of Michigan wanted a fair process and they wanted a fair map, it remains to be seen whether they're actually going to get that.
Somebody got into his drawer, evidently. I mean, and David, to secure our democracy and fair elections, you wrote that we may have to reform the very structure of House elections. And here you mention a bill put forward by Don Beyer of Virginia. What would this bill accomplish?
You know, I have come to think that independent commissions simply are a good start, but they're not enough to get us all the way towards fairness. And I think that the Beyer bill really is what we ought to be thinking about. And it's a new way of thinking about this for Americans, but it's one that has worked around the world really well. Really, it's a form of proportional representation. What Beyer is suggesting is that we move from single member winner-take-all districts to larger multi-member districts, and we use ranked choice voting. So a state like Massachusetts that, you know, right now has 9 members would instead have 3 districts of 3. You're not changing the number of people in the House or the number of representatives any state has. You're simply creating larger districts so that the lines don't matter as much. And then by using ranked choice voting, you are creating a more proportional system so that everybody actually gets a say. Everybody would be much more likely, I think, to have a member that they agreed with and represented their own perspective. And you might all of a sudden see Democrats getting elected from unlikely places. I mean, there's plenty of Democrats in Oklahoma and Kansas and Texas, right? Except the way that Republicans draw these lines, it's really hard to actually see them represented. And there's plenty of Republicans up in Connecticut and Massachusetts, and they don't have any representation either. And I mean, I think Congress might actually work better if you have some of these New England liberals again. I mean, I grew up with a guy like Lowell Weicker in the U.S. Senate, and Weicker was one of my heroes as a kid. You know, I mean, here's a Republican who stands up to Richard Nixon and says he has to resign, who stands up to Jesse Helms on AIDS and cultural issues in the 80s, who stands up to Reagan and says he wants out of Nicaragua, who writes the Americans with Disabilities Act. I mean, I think our Congress would be in a much better place if we still had people like that. And as long as we've got single member districts, you are going to see first that partisans are never going to let go of trying to influence drawing these lines. And second, we're going to create these frozen red or blue districts in which the only competition is in the party primary and the seats just go more and more extreme. And we're going to be in this doom loop without a way out of it. So I think we have to really take a step back and say, how did we get here? What do we do? And imagine the kind of structural reform that will be up to solving the really serious problems we have.
Can you imagine the way that government would work if given that scenario? If this Beyer bill were to move forward and if it became more universal across the country, how it would be a lot different for all of us, I'm sure.
I think it would. You know, I mean, I think suddenly what we have right now is, I think you've got one party, the Republicans, that have really been captured by an authoritarian part of their base. And the entire party feels like it has to go along because they're all afraid of a primary. So that puts, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert and Jim Jordan in charge of the show. And it leaves Donald Trump in charge of the show, right? Because everybody's afraid that he's going to show up in their district in primary, and like the 10 Republicans who had the courage to stand up and vote for impeachment, or the very, a majority of this caucus back on January 6th, even after the insurrection, after they cleaned up the blood in the glass, you had a majority of the Republican caucus that went back in and voted not to certify electors from Pennsylvania and Arizona, right? So what we need to do is re-incentivize these lawmakers. It's not a question of, if you've got an extreme view, you don't deserve representation on either side, but it's that you shouldn't be able to drive the bus for all of us from that sort of 18% of the Republican Party position. We need to re-incentivize lawmakers to be thinking about how they run and then how they govern and lead in a fundamentally different way.
Absolutely. David Daley, author of Rat Effed, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count, and Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. David, also a senior fellow at Fair Vote. David, as always, we appreciate your time with us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Look forward to talking to you again soon.
Anytime, a pleasure.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, a top Democratic political strategist on why spending huge sums of money on paid advertising is a waste of money. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
If you're a corporate employee, you know that something unpleasant is afoot when top executives are suddenly issuing statements about how committed they are to their employees, making sure that all of them are treated with dignity and respect. For example, the PR chief of a global outfit named Teleperformance, one of the world's largest call centers, was recently going on and on about how, quote, we value our people and their well-being, safety, and happiness. Why did the corporation feel such a desperate need to proclaim its virtue? Because it's been caught in a nasty scheme to spy on its own workers. Teleperformance, a $6.7 billion global behemoth that handles customer service calls for Amazon, Apple, Uber, etc., saves money on overhead by making most of its 380,000 employees around the world work from their own homes. That can be a convenience for many workers, but a new corporate policy, first imposed in March on thousands of its workers in Colombia, is an Orwellian nightmare. Teleperformance is pressuring them to sign an 8-page addendum to their employee contracts, allowing corporate-controlled video cameras, electronic audio devices, and data collection tools to be put in their homes to monitor their actions. I work in my bedroom, one employee noted. I don't want to have a camera in my bedroom. Neither would I, and I doubt that Teleperformance's $20 million a year CEO would allow one in his mansion. Uglier yet, the privacy-obliterating contract requires that even the children of employees can be spied on at home. Nonetheless, the Colombian worker signed because her supervisor said she could lose her job if she refused. Of course, Teleperformance Inc. assures us that the data it collects on children is not shared elsewhere. But how do we know that? Trust us, they say. This is Jim Hightower saying, do you? Howdy-ho, folks. Thanks for tuning in and sharing my weekly commentaries. Also, please join me for a live web show I host every other Tuesday, the Hightower Lowdown Happy Hour at the Chat and Chew Cafe. You can join the action live online as I chat with grassroots leaders and progressive sparklies from around the country. Go to hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew to find out about upcoming guests and watch past episodes. That's hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Peter Fenn has been helping Democrats win elections for decades. In a recent op-ed, he makes the case that changes in the media landscape demand a shift in focus from paid advertising to hardcore political organizing. And we say hello to Peter Fenn, Democratic Party's political strategist, consultant, television commentator, and owner of Fenn Communications Group, a political and public affairs media firm based in Washington, D.C. The firm has worked in over 300 campaigns from presidential to mayoral. Peter Fenn, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Jim, a real pleasure to be with you.
And our pleasure to have you with us. You recently wrote an op-ed for The Hill in which you make the point that for Democrats to spend huge sums of money on paid advertising is a waste of time. But this marks a serious shift in your own thinking. What changed your mind?
I'll tell you, Jim, I've been thinking about this for quite a long time. And as a Democratic media consultant, starting my firm in the early 80s when we relied on three networks, and there was a little bit of cable kind of coming in later, long before the internet and other means of communications. That was really the way you went. And I taught a class for over 20 years at George Washington's Graduate School of Political Management. And you know, I would tell my students, look, folks, you should be spending 70 to 80% of your money on communications. And primarily that's TV ads and radio ads, because you've got to communicate with voters directly, and that's what they're watching and listening to. So, Jim, what I began to find was because the media landscape had changed so dramatically, what we were seeing was pay more, get less. You weren't penetrating. This was a Mercedes protection program for TV station owners and for political consultants. So, you know, what I've even seen in the last couple decades, even the last 10 years, is, you know, we are spending huge amounts of money on our campaigns. I mean, we went from $6 billion total in 2016 to $14.4 billion in 2020. That's just in 4 years. And people are contributing huge amounts of money. The problem is that they're putting too much of it into television. And my article, which, as I say, I've been thinking about for a long time, is a result of the changing media landscape, which I think political consultants and especially our Democratic Party folks are not paying attention to nearly enough.
Well, as you point out in the op-ed, Democrats should be spending their money on is what they should be spending their money on is political organizing. In what ways have Democrats dropped the ball on this, and at what expense?
Well, you know, the example I cite at the beginning of the article is a group of progressive organizations who I love dearly. They're terrific people. They're working their tails off for Democrats, and they announced that they had $100 million campaign in August, that they were going to, but most of that money was going to be on TV spots. And my point is this: we now have the technology to, as I say, go back to the future. In other words, we have the technology to identify our voters, to know who they are, where they live, what they care about, and we should be building the most massive databases to communicate with these voters directly. And it has been shown forever and ever, the most important contact you have is face-to-face. The most important contacts you have are with family and friends. The most important contacts you have are with people at work who you know, and they trust you and trust your judgment. And one of the things that we have now begun to find out is that we have to go outside our traditional base to those folks who may be non-voters or vote infrequently. I mean, you saw it in the turnout figures from 2020. We had 160 million people voting. Well, in 2016, there's 137 million. That's 23 million more people turned out in the polls. Now, who are they? Why are they voting? Where can we get to them directly and personally? Handwritten notes. Phone calls are tough. But now that the COVID is over, you know, I am a big believer in door-to-door. I'm a big believer in folks having neighborhood headquarters so that they know who's standing up for them. And so I think that what we've got to do is take that technology and really unifocus on our voters. And Republicans, I think lately, we were ahead of them for a while, but I think lately Republicans have done a better job. And part of it, as my friend Hal Malchow has talked about and cited, you know, these Trump voters hate Democrats. They hate the establishment. They're motivated. Now, our people aren't too happy with Donald Trump either. But, you know, there's this tendency now to put in effect what I call a Jesse Ventura effect, the former governor of Minnesota. People were turning out in that election. They never turned out before. They were riding in on their motorcycles, worried about the helmet laws. I mean, they had real reasons, personal reasons to support them. And I think that's what Democrats have to figure out is how do you go to those folks? And the polling from Pew shows something very interesting, Jim. It shows if you look at non-voters, people who didn't even vote in 2020, they found out that when pressed, they supported Joe Biden over Donald Trump by 15 points. Now, to me, we left something on the table, and we still won the popular vote by 7 million votes, but we're leaving people on the table. And the other thing we've got to do is concentrate on those lower level races like Congress, Senate, governor, state legislatures, and really put our effort into electing those people. And that's organization. Mm-hmm. You know, is it some media? Of course it's media, but we have got to turn things around.
The media needs to support the more organizational efforts as opposed to the other way around, I think was probably a good way to look at it, right? Yeah. You know, and it's been noted often that Democrats have a rural problem. I immediately think of Hillary Clinton running for president and all the places she didn't go. And you devote your op-ed to a part of this. How do you understand Democrats' failure to attract rural voters?
Well, I think it's due to a lot of things. I think that the perception that Democrats or Democratic candidates are city elite, you know, the folks who don't really care about rural areas. You know, some folks have certainly been out there disproving that. People like John Tester in Montana, who's written a great book called Grounded. You know, we're seeing it in West Virginia too with Joe Manchin. But basically, you know, as I said, you know, I cite at some points my old state where I went to college, Minnesota, and the work I used to do out there as a young kid. They called it the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, the DFL, for a reason, because we communicated with those folks. And I think we've written them off. I think folks are intimidated when they see caravans of Trump supporters on opening day for the fishing season. I think they're worried about being berated by their friends at the coffee shop. And we've got to go there, because as you point out, Hillary Clinton lost the rural vote to Donald Trump, and Trump got 59% of the rural vote in 2016. Well, guess what happened in 2020? That figure went up for Trump from 59 to 65%, according to that Pew poll. So even though Biden won, as I say, by 7 million votes, he did worse than Hillary Clinton did with rural voters. So my argument in this piece is that is heavily organization based, and we've got to get those folks back. Because look, can you lose it by 10 points, maybe even 15 points? Well, yes, but can you lose it 75-25? No, you can't. And you have to communicate with those folks who care deeply about their country, who care deeply about patriotism, who care deeply about their fundamental rights, whether they be gun rights or individual rights. And so, we have to start talking to them about what it is that we're doing to help rural America in healthcare, in helping folks with kids so they can afford to send them to college, so that they can afford to have daycare. They feel ignored, and that's darn important.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking to Peter Fenn, Democratic Party political strategist, consultant, television commentator, owner of Fenn Communications Group, which is a political and public affairs media firm based in Washington, D.C. So, Peter, you mentioned some messaging things right there that need to happen. What about the political organizing that needs to happen to attract rural voters? What do Democrats need to do to get that back?
Well, I think one of the things that we learned from the Obama years a bit is, the world was falling apart. Poor Barack Obama becomes president of the United States. It looks like the auto industry is going down. This is really a depression that was happening in this country. We call it a recession, but it was almost greater than that. He had real serious problems to solve, and in my view, did a tremendous job with that. But his approach was solve the problem, move on to the next one. And a lot of us, at the time were saying, Mr. President, you got to tell people what you've done. The whole thing, tell them what you're going to do, tell them what you've done, and then tell them what you've done again. And it was tough because Democrats didn't get credit, I don't think, for a lot of what was accomplished during that period. Part of it was because he didn't want to go out there and brag and beat his chest all the time. He wanted to move on to the next problem. So I'm not saying he did everything perfectly, but no president does. But, we have to explain in very specific terms that people understand what it is we care about, which is what they care about, and why we're working so hard for them and why it matters. And we got to go big. I mean, to Joe Biden's credit, on a lot of this, he's going big. On Barack Obama's, to his credit, healthcare, he went big. Now, we're going to get to the point where folks used to say it in these town meetings, I'll just keep your fingers off of my Medicare. Keep the government out of my Medicare. Excuse me, that's a government program. And folks, I think they're going to be saying, well, what about this healthcare stuff? Well, okay, what about it? We need to give them prescription drugs, coverage, really good prescription drug coverage. They should be able to deal with hearing aids or eyeglasses if they're senior citizens. And childcare has to be front and center. So, we have to say, hey, we're here to solve your problems, and we're the ones that are doing it.
And so as you're answering that question, and So let's talk about, in addition to the rural focus, because this is something else that you mentioned in the op-ed. You suggest keeping a focus on the less likely voters and convincing them of what is at stake in 2022. I mean, let's face it, everybody that's far to the left and everyone that's far to the right, they're going to vote the way they're going to vote, and you already know that. It's everybody in between that you have to be looking at. So who are these potential voters, and what should Democrats do to connect with them?
One of the things that we've all begun to look at lately, and again, my friend Hal Malchow did a nice piece on this, is that increasingly that group in the middle has begun to shrink, right? So that you have Democrats, they say they're independents. You know, a third of America says they're independent voters. But when you push them and say, hey, well, where do you usually lean, Democrat or Republican? Then that figures down to about 11% of folks who are kind of true independents. Now, obviously, they're key to go after. But, you know, I think one of the things that we've got to do is we've got to go after some of those folks who are infrequent voters. They may vote in presidential elections. They may vote, you know, they have a sheriff's race where they got a buddy that's running for sheriff. They might vote in those races, but, you know, they're not the habitual voters, or it's hard to vote. They've moved. They don't know whether they're registered. You know, one of the things Republicans have decided is they don't really want people to vote. I mean, they want to make life as difficult as humanly possible to walk into that voting booth. Now that, to me, and we should call it this, that is un-American. That is not what this country is all about. That is wrong. And so we have to convince folks, you know, a lot of folks get this. African Americans get it. Hey, I've been battling this for 150 years. I'm not, I'm going to stand in that damn line for hours if I have to, because I fought for that right. But I think we have to get it out to a lot more people who are reluctant to vote, and help them. And one of the reasons that we had such high turnout, clearly, was because people could vote by mail. You look at those states, come on, fraud in Colorado, fraud in California, fraud in Oregon. Come on, there isn't any. I mean, this works really, really well. And you know, other countries have figured this out. I mean, I'm proud that we had almost 2/3 of eligible voters vote in this election. But, you know, I'm not going to be happy till we've got 90% of people who are out there voting. So anyway, I think that's a big part of this puzzle. And it's not easy. And I'm not saying that, you know, I got all the answers. Good God, no, I knows I do not. But I do think that as Democrats, you know, we've got to spend more time. And you look at the special election in Georgia. Did we win that because I think, what did that race cost? $500 million, for crying out loud? I mean, that's obscene. We won that because they organized all the way down to the precinct level. You know, we had tremendous efforts by the Democratic Party and by the independent groups in Georgia, and it paid off.
Do you have a sense that Democrats are opening up to kind of your directive on political organizing? I mean, is it a hard sell, or do you see Democrats willing to make that commitment that things need to be different?
I don't know. I hope so. I mean, I hope the party committees are doing it. I hope the independent expenditure groups are doing it. I hope some of my look, I'm an old guy. I've been in this a long time. I hope some of my folks who are media consultants are going in there to meetings and saying, hey, you know, I can put another, you know, $5 million into TV ads if you want. The price has gone skyrocketing. It's crazy. I mean, it goes money in my pocket, but, you know, there's other things to do with that money that may help you win. I mean, I'll tell you a funny story. And my partner, Tom King, at the time, had a lot of great partners. And we were, this was in the late 80s, and we were in a tough primary first in New York with Nita Lowey running for her first race for Congress. And some of the folks that actually working for Mario Cuomo at the time and others were telling us we should buy New York City TV. Now, that was great for us. what do we get? 10, 15% of the time by. That was a real good deal. You make one spot, you make all this money. Tom but Tom was the driving force up there in these meetings. And he said to them, to their faces, hey, this is great for me. But you know something? You're better in doing local radio. You're better in doing direct mail. You're better in making sure that your target voters are coming out, because you put that kind of money in New York City radio, even though some of your rich opponents are doing it, you're not gonna make it. And lo and behold, they followed Tom's strategy, did not put that money into New York City, and she won that primary, and she beat Joe Diagardi in the general election. And that's one of those things where you are arguing against your own best financial interest, to be perfectly frank. So now this is easy for me now, because I'm not really in this game that much, but I think a lot of my colleagues and buddies should also speak up a bit on it.
Mm-hmm. Now, Peter, given the current political context, razor-thin margin in the House, looming threat of redistricting and Republican efforts to suppress voting, which we talked about a little bit, in specific communities important to Democrats, what's your sense they can maintain their position in Congress in the 2022 election? Historically, it doesn't work out well for the party in power.
No, it certainly doesn't. The average party in power loses 26 House seats and 4 Senate seats, I believe. It's not easy, but it has gone back and forth. We were the consultants for the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee in 1998, and everybody was saying, "Oh man, Democrats are going to get hosed. It's going to be terrible." And all of us, and not just us, but the committee and the Clinton folks, they concentrated on the message and getting out the vote. And actually, we picked up seats in that 1998 in those races. And so, I look, a lot of this is beyond our control. Where is Joe Biden going to be? Where are Democrats going to be in a year's time? I mean, if the election were this November, bye-bye. I mean, I don't think we could do this in such a short period of time right now, given the situation, COVID coming back, given Afghanistan, to be perfectly blunt. But look, in this business, you're a hero one minute, you're a bum the next, then you're a hero again. And so in a year, if we do things right, if we start now on that organizing, if we don't say, oh, we're going to spend all our money in the last 60 days on TV ads, we have a better shot. If we give our people the arguments for why Democrats are doing the job. My simple slogan for the Democrats and for Joe Biden are getting the job done. That's it. I mean, when we get down to it by next year, my guess is folks will say, hey, they've been getting the job done.
Okay. Peter Fenn, Democratic Party political strategist and consultant, owner of Fenn Communications Group, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Peter, we really enjoyed our time with you today. We'd love to have you back again soon.
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate it very much. Look forward to that.
And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with former New Jersey Governor Christine Todd Whitman about why she believes electing moderate Democrats could be critical to saving the Republican Party and democracy itself.
We are Republicans with a plea. Elect Democrats. I guess I got to start by asking you, Governor, are you serious about that?
Oh, absolutely. What we're saying is that when Republicans are faced with an extreme right Republican candidate versus a centrist Democrat, they should vote for the Democrat. And we're saying the same thing to the Democrats. When they have someone who is to the extreme on the left, they should vote for a centrist Republican. We need to get back our principled pragmatists in order to get the country back to the center. This country functions best with a center right and a center left. And what we're concentrating on, though, is trying to rebuild the Republican Party from inside. We're not talking about a third party at this point, certainly not for this election cycle, but we very much believe that we should be supporting those. And right now, we've released a list of 20 incumbents. We'll be going after challengers in the future. But right now, we believe we should be supporting those who have stood up to the big lie, who acknowledge that what happened on January 6th was not a regular tourist visit, and that the election in 2020 was not stolen.
What kind of reaction did you get from your fellow Republicans?
Actually, so far, there have been a lot of very positive. I mean, there's some obviously negative ones, but for the most part, it's been people who said, finally, something in the center. I am not at home. And actually, Bill, you'd be surprised how many Democrats I've heard from as well, who said, I'm never voted Republican, but I can and I will. I like this idea. So there's a hunger out there. I mean, you've got to remember that now 50% of the registered voters are registered independent. That means the Republicans, Democrats have 25 each, but they don't. Democrats have more than Republicans in registered voters, but it's closer. But we've never been at that number before, where 50% of the registered voters refuse to affiliate with either party.
And of course, part of the what would happen if Republicans follow your advice is most likely Democrats would hold on to control of the House of Representatives, and Kevin McCarthy would lose his chance to be the Republican speaker. That's a price you're willing to pay.
Oh, more than willing to pay, because frankly, from the way Kevin McCarthy has behaved, we don't believe that he would, or we know, frankly, if he were to become speaker, he would continue down the path of Donald Trump. He would continue to say that the election in 2020 was stolen. And you got to understand these things, that they're challenging the election of 2020, calling for recounts and audits, passing legislation to solve problems that don't exist. This is part of a concerted effort to undermine the public's confidence in our electoral system so that the next time they lose, they can just claim it was stolen. And things can get really ugly, as we saw on January 6th. 2020 election, we should be celebrating. I mean, in the midst of a pandemic, with an administration that for months ahead of time had been saying that there'd be all sorts of fraud and that would be stolen if they didn't win, we had more people, we had record turnouts, and it was safe, secure, and accurate, as better than 60 lawsuits have found, heard by judges from both sides of the aisle, some appointed by Donald Trump himself. There's no there to this. So there's no reason for this to continue except to as an effort to undermine the public's confidence in our overall electoral system.
Do you think our democratic system itself is at risk here?
Very much so. I am terribly worried about our democracy. We seem to have forgotten the importance of the rule of law and the Constitution. Certainly, Donald Trump thought the Constitution was an inconvenient document, and the rule of law didn't apply to him. And that is a really dangerous place to be, I think. And, looking back in history, that governments, no government of the kind of experiment that we have been undergoing in a democratic republic has ever lasted forever. They don't. But I'm not ready to say this is the time that our democracy should die.
You mentioned that you have a list of 20 people so far that you are going to support. Are these? Could you give us an idea of some of the Democrats you would support and some of the Republicans you were calling on people to support?
Sure. I mean, Andy Kim in New Jersey, down in the 3rd District, Slaughter, Michigan in 08, Golden in Maine in the 2nd District. For the Republicans, Kissinger in Illinois and Fred Upton in Michigan. We're supporting Murkowski and Liz Cheney, among others. I mean, what we're doing is being very strategic and going into those races where this kind of support or endorsement could help. We don't have to persuade every Republican to vote Democrat. That's not what it needs. Joe Biden won the presidency because 7% of those who voted for Trump in 2016 switched to Biden in 2020. And so when we're playing in districts where the margin is 2, 3, maybe 5%, it doesn't take everybody. You don't have to switch all Republican votes there. You can make a difference with just a few if you get them out to vote. So that's why we're being strategic in our targeting here.
And now I know because of interviews that you've done before, and also interviews that I've done with people like Bill Kristol and others in the Lincoln Project, that I guess the hope was that post-Trump, the Republican Party would get back to what the Republican Party used to be, a strong, independent, not opposition party, other party, the second major party. I started out my political career working for a good, strong centrist Republican in Marin County, California. But that didn't happen. The party did not switch back. Why? What happened?
Well, Donald Trump had created a cult, and his voters, his base is very, very loyal, and they adhere to him. I mean, we're not really a party, those self-described Republicans. There's not really a party because there are no set of principles. They didn't adopt a platform. It was whatever Donald Trump says you must believe at a particular time. And so it's not a party. It's not something that really we can support or should be supporting. So I think I was trying to find it. There's a recent fundraising appeal from the Republican National Committee that basically says you don't want to be called a traitor, and you will be if you don't. You're disloyal if you don't contribute to Trump. I mean, really? That's the kind of language we use in this country now, a party uses, which also tells me that, oh, by the way, that a lot of the big donors have decided this is going too far. It's undermining our democracy, and we just can't support it anymore.
Well, as you described it, it's not a party so much as it is a one-man cult.
Right.
But there seem to be a lot of Republicans, unlike yourself, who are unwilling to stand up and put any distance between themselves and Donald Trump. What are they afraid of? And is he that strong? Is he that dangerous, that powerful politically?
Well, his supporters are. I mean, what we've seen, which is really scary to me, Bill, is the number of those who have worked on overseeing the polls and administering the elections, the death threats that they're getting in states where Joe Biden won. I mean, and so they're quitting. They're saying, look, I didn't sign on for this. I can't subject my family to this. I mean, they have literally, some have had to move homes, move their house where their residences. They've had to hire security. This is not what we're supposed to be about. But these people who support Trump, we saw it on January 6th. That was an effort to overthrow the government, frankly. No two ways about it. They wanted to stop the counting of the electoral ballots and throw out the vote. That was to undermine, to throw out, to change our whole election. And we cannot let that happen, but it could. And that's what these people are afraid of. They're afraid that the Trump voters are going to be the ones who come out. It's going to be interesting to see. That's the play here in New Jersey, I believe, that the Republicans are assuming that the Democrats are going to be complacent because they have 1 million more registered Democrats than Republicans in the state. And so they don't have to worry because they're not going to come out in droves, but the Trump base will. And so they're really playing hard to the Trump base. I don't think it's going to work here in the state, but that's, I think, the calculation they've made.
I've often wondered, is the Trump base, in terms of numbers, is the Trump base big enough in itself to win general elections?
I don't think so. I mean, he's not at 50%. He's lost almost every election. He lost the last election, lost Congress, lost the Senate. And particularly when you see that 50% of the registered voters are independent, don't associate with a party, I am willing to bet you, I don't have the breakdown, but I am willing to bet that a great number of those, a high percentage of those, are dissident Republicans.
Do you think it's possible for a Republican today to, let's say, openly, publicly say they do not accept the big lie, in effect, oppose Donald Trump and win?
I do, and that's why we're supporting these candidates, these 10 Republicans that we announced today, and there are more. It's just that we wouldn't make a difference in their particular districts. Their races aren't that close. But yes, you have 10 right here who did have shown a pattern of standing up to this and a pattern of pushing back and saying that, January 6th was not just a regular tourist visit. And so they're there. Just nobody has had their back before. And things now are getting serious enough that I think you're going to find more and more people who are going to join in this effort. And every time we do anything that's press-wise, we get lots of responses from people saying, finally, somebody's talking about something in the center. Some want to see a third party. We're not trying to do that right now. Maybe that might have to happen somewhere down the road because we can't get enough Republicans to get elected the principled centrists to get elected, but we'll see.
Can you explain Chuck Grassley? I was so surprised to see him at this Trump rally last week. I mean, when I was doing Crossfire at CNN, Senator Grassley was a frequent guest. I admired him a lot. Strong, centrist, Republican, I always felt. He's been there a long time.
Right.
If anybody, it seems to me, could be independent and do whatever he wanted, it would be Senator Grassley.
Yeah, but he said it, which I loved. I mean, it wasn't exactly a ringing endorsement of Donald Trump when he said, I was born at night, but not last night, and not to accept not to accept the support of someone who's supported by 91% of the Republicans in Iowa. I'd be crazy. So it wasn't a ringing endorsement, but it was a recognition that of those who are still registered as Republicans, Donald Trump still has an extraordinary hold on them.
Right. The opposite of that, of course, and you mentioned her earlier, is Liz Cheney. Mm-hmm. Boy, talk about a profile in courage.
Yes.
Right? What do you think her chances are? Can she hold on?
I think she can, but that's why we're going to be playing in that race, and that's why we're raising her up as someone that people ought to watch and support if you want to get back to the kind of government where people stand on principle. I mean, I haven't agreed with her with a lot of her positions that she's taken, socially and otherwise, but I have the utmost respect for what she's been doing and standing up, and I will support her in any way that I can. We know that the people that we're putting out there as being the principled pragmatists are not all going to agree on issues. They're different, come from different places, and that's okay. But what they have shown is they put the Constitution and their oath of office above their political party, and that's what we need is people who understand they took an oath to support the Constitution of the United States, not an oath to support the Republican or Democratic Party.
Now, I know you've given this a lot of thought, so I'd love to get your take on, so here comes this outsider, no political experience, this brash real estate developer from New York City, and in a year, he takes over the Republican Party. I mean, just takes it over, lock, stock, and barrel. How did it happen so fast?
Well, it's a reflection of the fact that Congress had been fairly useless for quite some time before that. They had not been passing the big pieces of legislation. So much of the country felt they were left behind. I mean, this really started with the Tea Party, and then they moved away from their libertarian background and went really highly into the social positions as being their primary concern, but they started it, so there was that nucleus there. And when you add the fact that you have so many in the country who felt Congress just wasn't paying any attention to them, wasn't answering their issues, they felt left behind and ignored. And you had somebody who came in and said, I get it, and I'm going to turn it all upside down. And so they grabbed it. Unfortunately, he did turn everything upside down, but not in the way that I think most people wanted. Sure, did he have some programs and policies that people would agree with? Absolutely. Everybody does. But the damage he was doing otherwise was so overwhelming that a lot of people have soured on it. But still, for those people who I have made the analogy from time to time of Jonestown and Jim Jones drunk the Kool-Aid, his supporters, and they're not dying themselves, but boy, they sure are undermining our form of government and contributing to its demise.
Bill Press with New Jersey Governor Christine Todd Whitman. If you'd like to hear the entire episode, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible: David Daley, Peter Fenn, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.